direction of Democratic Governor Newsom.
Next up, let's talk club news.
On Tuesday, girls volleyball faced off against Dublin.
Tomorrow, wear your favorite jersey. On Wednesday,
Schedule for Wednesday, August 25th has been changed to be virtual.
Hello Pioneers and welcome back to your National News Show. I'm Sawyer Brisson.
And I'm Ty Martin. Thanks for tuning in. Just like last week, we decided to turn this news show into a more informative show about Russia and Ukraine.
That's right, Ty. And just like last week, we're going to throw in some other news stories before we turn it over to Mr. Mathis and Abby Ryan to tell us more. But for now, let's kick things off with this week's top stories.
Florida Governor Ron DeSantis called out a group of high school students Wednesday, telling them to, quote, stop with this COVID theater, end quote, and asking them to remove their masks. The Republican governor was attending a news conference at the University of South Florida in Tampa and was visibly annoyed with students as he approached the lectern.
In more Florida news, the governor has also announced a new bill many refer to as, quote, don't say gay, end quote, bill. The bill is now designed to limit how the LGBTQ community is discussed in public school classrooms by restricting conversations, considering instruction, particularly related to the youngest elementary children. But those limitations could be felt in higher grades.
The bill allows parents to sue school districts if they are not privy to situations related to their children or if their students are encouraged to have discussions on sexual orientation or gender identity. Florida's House has approved the bill and it will appear before the Senate to vote on.
Now, we're going to throw it over to Abby and Mr. Mathis to give us more insight into Russia and Ukraine.
Hi Pioneers, my name is Abby Ryan and today I'll be joined by one of our history teachers at Orange, Mr. Mathis. Thank you so much for coming on.
Absolutely.
Let's kind of jump into some of the questions here. So there's been a lot of talk about Russia blocking a lot of the social media sites just from their citizens. Of course, this isn't really new practice, but what kind of implications do you think this will have on not only them, but for the U.S. as well?
Yeah, it's definitely a big deal. You know, they're an authoritarian form of government, so they are going to restrict media. They have state media. Not a free press like we have here. But with the war starting, they've really cut down on what's being posted on social media, what is accessible to their public, because they're fearful that the public won't support the war. And that can be problematic for us because ultimately I think what will end this thing is backlash from Russia. I think it implodes from inside. And so Putin's doing everything in his power to prevent that from happening. I mean, I saw footage the other day of they were literally going up to people on the streets and just saying, let me see your phone, and looking at what they had written on their phone and the messages that they'd been sending, and if it was wrong, they were arresting them. So it's a huge deal in terms of the Russian war effort continuing. It's a huge deal, obviously, that they're fearful that public support will crumble, and that's something that Putin has to deathly avoid.
Right. So I know a lot of people are worried about what kind of economic implications this will have on the U.S., but as people stop traveling and things like concerts will stop being held, what do you think this will have on Russia's economy?
Oh, Russia's economy is in big trouble. The ruble, which is their currency, is about as valuable as a single penny here in the United States. Wow. Their stock market lost something like 65% of its value. I read a report from many of the banking economists that said that there is a 90% chance that their economy is going to default because they were removed from an organization called SWIFT, which prevents intercontinental trading amongst banks. So they're completely reliant upon their own backing for their banks. Panic ensues. People in Russia start running to the bank and withdrawing their money, and then the banks run out of money. It's basically what happened here during the Great Depression when banks failed. And that's going to happen in Russia. I mean, their economy is in shambles, and the people are really gonna feel that. And that's partly why Putin's really cutting down on the social media, is because the people are going to start feeling it. And they're going to wonder why they're in this situation, and he's got to control the narrative desperately because the sanctions are going to really hurt him.
Good uphill. As many kids in our school have been worried. How close do you think a draft is? And then could you also go into a little bit more detail just about the legalities of that?
Yeah, sure. As most boys that are 18 years old know, and if you've been in a government class, you have to fill out the selective service form, which basically makes you eligible to be drafted if it's ever necessary. Right now, we've got 1.4 million service members in the United States Armed Service. There is absolutely no threat of a draft at this point. Now, could things get crazy if NATO gets involved in this thing? Sure. I mean, it's always a possibility, but I think it's very, very slim. I don't think it's something that we really have to worry about. If NATO gets involved, then there could be a substantial increase in the amount of American involvement in the conflict. But we would, that's a last resort type thing, and I don't think we have anything to worry about.
Could you go into a little bit more detail about what NATO is?
Sure. NATO is the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It's an alliance amongst basically Western Europe and, initially it was Western Europe and the United States. And that was in response to the old Soviet Union and their aggressions, not only in Europe but around the world. So when the Soviet Union, post-World War II, they grabbed up a bunch of territory in Eastern Europe, promised that they would have democratic elections, didn't, turned into satellite communist countries. And Stalin, who was the dictator at the time, said, I'm doing this because I need a buffer from Germany, from Western Europe. We'd been invaded twice by them in a 50-year period of time. But then he started to foment communist revolutions in Greece, in Turkey, in Iran. And that really, we're like, well, what's going on with that? That's not a buffer. You're spreading it elsewhere in the world. And what the real kicker is when they tried to grab Berlin as part of the Berlin blockade, and we responded with the infamous Berlin airlift. And after that, Western Europe said, we want protection. We want a deterrent against Soviet aggression. So they formed this alliance with the United States and Canada that if the Soviets ever attacked a member of NATO, then all of NATO is going to war with them. Since the end of the Cold War, NATO has expanded dramatically. It's gone and grabbed, Poland's a member now, all the Baltic states, Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia are members. So it's grown substantially, and that's part of the reason why Putin's doing what he's doing, is because he feels threatened by the expansion of NATO. And there's a lot, it's a very complex conflict. There's a lot of reasons why it's going on, but one of them is definitely the expansion of NATO.
So that's just, NATO is just there to help the little guy?
Maybe? It's mutually beneficial,
Okay.
but certainly certain nations like Estonia are much less capable of defending themselves against the Soviet Russia
Right.
than, say, Poland or Germany or the United States would be. But we just want to prevent Russian expansion and Russian aggression. And the best way to do that is to have a bunch of people together, including some of the big dogs, and
Right.
say, you mess with us, you're messing with all of us.
Right.
And it's pretty effective.
Yeah, I guess that kind of leads us into our next question. To kind of go into more detail about why this is so personal to Putin, and then a little bit more about what he'll truly gain from taking over Ukraine.
Yeah, like I said, it's pretty complicated.
Right.
So I guess you can break it down into some multiple spheres. One of them is economic, which I'll go to. One of them is the geographical vulnerability related to NATO. One is political, for sure. So if you look at a map of Europe, the whole kind of northern section of Europe, from basically the western portions of Germany all the way to Moscow, is known as the Northern European Plains. And it's the equivalent of the Great Plains here in the United States. Flat, agricultural area, open, really hard to defend militarily.
Right.
Because it's open spaces, right?
Yeah.
It's really easy to locate where the enemy is and attack them. The farther east you go, the bigger it gets. The farther west you go, it bottlenecks. Okay, and it bottlenecks basically in Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, the Baltic states. So what Putin wants to do is push westward to close that gap. And of course, NATO is moving eastward, which widens the gap. The Russians are also aligned with Belarus, borders right next to them, next to Poland. And if Ukraine were to become a member of NATO, or just simply become friendly to Western Europe, which they were trying to be, then it creates a huge issue for the Russians in terms of their own security. They basically are in an indefensible position, as is the case with Belarus, because Belarus would be sticking out and they would be easily defeated. So there's a strategic kind of geographic reason for that. In terms of economics, Russia is a petroleum state. They're literally economically no different than a lot of these Middle Eastern countries that are major oil and natural gas producers. Their economy absolutely depends on the production of natural gas and oil, which they sell to Europe.
Okay.
What they discovered about 10 years ago, right off the coast of Crimea in the Ukraine, were enormous supplies of natural gas and petroleum. And so economically speaking, what the Russians are terrified of is that Ukraine starts to drill that, and all of a sudden the Europeans are buying the natural gas and oil from Ukraine and not buying it from Russia. Their economy is in shambles. So that's part of the reason why he grabbed Ukraine in 2014, was to get access to that oil. There's also major pipelines that run through the Ukraine that the Ukrainians were taxing or tariffing the Russians substantially for the use of that. They want to get rid of those tariffs. So of course there's geographic reasons, there's economic reasons, and then the political reason, which I think is why it's so personal to Putin. In 2014, Ukraine had a revolution. I think it was called the Orange Revolution. And they ousted a president that was basically a puppet of Putin. And he had been very friendly to Russia and to their ideas and aligned with them economically. And the people of Ukraine didn't want to do that anymore. They looked at the European Union and they saw how profitable it was and how much progress was made in Western Europe, and they wanted to be a part of that. So they basically tried to oust this president through electoral processes. He arrested the political opposition. That's when they took to the streets, and you might remember they had massive protests in Kyiv, and they were getting shot at, and it was crazy. But they eventually got rid of the Russian guy and replaced him with a democratically elected, Western-friendly president. That's Zelensky.
Who's still in
power.
Okay.
And what Putin is terrified of politically is that you had a situation where the people rose up and threw off a unwanted leader, have the potential of joining the European Union, of thriving economically, and the people of Russia would go, well, why don't we do that?
Scared of that precedent.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's the one thing he wants more than anything else, is to remain in power. So he throws around words of denazifying and there's fascist regime, and in reality it comes down to he doesn't want to have a democracy on his doorstep that came about through revolution. He wants to control the oil. He wants to be more prepared and have a better defensive position against NATO.
Of course.
So like I said, it's pretty complex, but that's kind of the gist of it.
You did a really good job explaining. Thank you.
Sure.
So thank you so much for coming on today.
Absolutely.
We're going to throw it back over to Ty and Sawyer.
Well, that's all we have for you today, Pioneers. Thanks for tuning in. For The Juice, I'm Sawyer Brisson.
And I'm Ty Martin. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.